Good afternoon. Since the beginning of June, the law school has had a series of programs on various aspects of race in the law. We continue that series today. I thought it very important that our community hear from our students, that our community learn what our students are doing in their activism against racism. Today, we have a terrific panel of students who will describe for you their efforts. What I'm going to do is quickly introduce them. As always, I apologize to them that my introductions are going to be very brief, so we have much time as possible for everyone to listen to their remarks. I'll introduce them in the order in which they're speaking. Each will have about 10 minutes to offer their thoughts, and then at the end, we'll take questions. And as always, if you send your questions in, I'll then present them to the panel. I'm simply going to have them speak in alphabetical order by first name. And so the first speaker will be Dallas Lopez. He's a member of the Gila River Indian community. He's in his third year at Berkeley Law. He served as the Native American Law Student co-founder and co-president, the editor-in-chief of the La Raza Law Journal, the chair of the People for Color Conference, and on the board of the Coalition for Diversity. Prior to law school, he taught English in East Los Angeles for 7 years. Our second speaker will be Ebeid. She's a third-year law student and was formerly the president of the Middle Eastern and North African Law Student Association. She's a first-generation Egyptian immigrant and professional. She developed an interest in intellectual property law during her first and second years at Berkeley Law. Her one summer, she worked in an AI company using machine learning to uncover sensitive information with regard to unstructured data. And after graduation, she plans on practicing with a tech transitions group at a firm in Palo Alto. Our third speaker will be Justin Brooks. He's also a third-year student. Last year, he was the co-president of Sable. He's the co-host of the Blacklisted podcast. The fourth speaker will be Knychelle Passmore. She's a 2L and co-president of the Law Students of African Descent at Berkeley Law. She's also a Henderson Center for Social Justice scholar and a member of the Women of Color Collective and first-generation professionals. As co-president of LSAD, Knychelle engages in advocacy and community outreach that centers the interests of the Black community in Berkeley and beyond. Fifth speaker will be Maya Harmon. She's a 3L, and she's the current co-editor-in-chief of the Black Berkeley Journal of African American Law and Policy. Last year, she was the external affairs chair of the Law Students of African Descent. She continues to be a very active member. And finally, our concluding speaker, I got backwards. Maya Harmon will be the sixth speaker. The fifth speaker will be Maya Campbell, who's a third-year law student at Berkeley Law. She earned her undergraduate degree in history from Reed College in Portland, Oregon. At Berkeley, she's a member of Law Students of African Descent and the former co-chair of the Women of Color Collective. She also currently serves as senior articles and essays editor of the California Law Review. So with that, I'll turn it over to these six speakers and so look forward to listening to them. And my thanks to each of you for taking time from your busy schedules to be part of this. And so with that, Dallas, it's yours.
Hi, hello, everybody. Thank you for making time today to spend some time with us, panelists. And panelists, I'm very proud to be on here with you all. I'm going to try to be shorter to give others a little more time to speak. But before we begin, I wanted to recognize and do a land acknowledgement. So I'd like to take a moment to recognize that Berkeley sits on the territory of the Ho-Chinn, the ancestral and unceded land of the Xochiano, the speaking Ohlone people, the successors in the historic and sovereign Verona Band of Alameda County. The land was and continues to be of great importance to the Muwekma, Ohlone tribe, and other familiar descendants of the Verona Band. We recognize that every member of the Berkeley community has benefited and continues to benefit from the use and occupation of this land since the institution's founding in 1868. Consistent with our values of community and diversity, we have a responsibility to acknowledge and to make visible the university's relationship to Native peoples and others. By offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold the University of California, Berkeley more accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. I hope that that becomes a staple of what we hear at every single event that we have here at Berkeley. It situates us in a position where we recognize a history and advantage that people have taken in order to sort of be ahead, myself included. I identify as a Latinx man. I use he, him. My mother's parents are from Chihuahua, Mexico. My dad and my grandmother grew up on the Gila River Indian Reservation, which is located about 15, 20 minutes south of Phoenix. And so I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about how you can get involved and learn a little bit about the activism. I have a number of things to share, but hopefully some of them will stick with you all. Again, I'm available to you if you ever would like to reach out. So first, the land acknowledgement might seem very simple and small, but it's something that is integral to starting and recognizing the history and the things that have happened locally here, as well as around our world and nation. So I'm a part of NALSA, the Native American Law Students Association, and we have been working to get the land acknowledgement read by as many people as possible. I believe last year Dean Alvarez read the land acknowledgement to the 1Ls, and I'm not sure if that happened this year. We have tried to get institutional implementation of this at Berkeley Law, but we have not able to sort of achieve that. And so what we've been doing is try to go to professor. And so something that could be really powerful that each one of you are here could take on is at the start of class, even though we've had the first week, if your professor has not read a land acknowledgement, to send an email or a message in Zoom to ask them if they'd be willing to do so. The Native students here and those who are who've joined us in those efforts, allies have done that work, but it sometimes becomes really hard to keep that up. And so those of you who are here, I will go ahead and paste the land acknowledgement into the discussion. So you all can keep that if you like and send that to your professors if it's possible for you. And I think that's a great way to get things going. Once professors start to do that, I think it will be easier for us to get that institutional support there. For us at NALSA, for those of you who are here, about 4 years ago, there was one Native student out of the entire class of 900 students. And so I initially did not want to come to Berkeley Law because of that. I wanted to go to a school that had more of a support and community, as I'm sure it will be expressed by many others here too. And so that changed the year that Dean Chemerinsky was coming in, Dean Alvarez as well. And we went from 1 student to 11 1Ls and have continued to grow. But that growth and that consistency needs to be continual. And so one of the things that is difficult as students is that we care very deeply to have community, and we have to build that community. And we have some institutional support, but a lot of it has to depend on us. And so I think those of you who are here today who can ask questions or encourage those leaders to also recruit more brown, black, queer, trans folks, women to our school, the better. And we've done a good job of that, but we can always do more. And so I think that is a really important step. That's something that we've been working on these last 2 years, is to build that community. And I think we, at this current moment, have around 25 who identify as Native, and we have about 55 people, or another 25 who are allies who come to our meetings and to support us. So another thing that we'd like to do is to invite you all to attend our meetings on Zoom. Everyone is welcome. We ask that you be thoughtful and considerate about your positionality, but definitely we need to be a strong community here. That brings me to my third point really quickly, and I'm at a 5-minute mark. And so I will ask that we all recognize our privilege in being at Berkeley Law, in the sense that we will be in places where we will have impact. And so one of the here is to hope that many more people who don't identify as being Native, who might us and learn. We recognize that you all will be in positions as judges. Says my internet connection is unstable. Can you all hear me? Okay. And so if during these 3 years that you were here, or the 1 year that you have left, can spend some time with other Native students or doing some work while you're here at Berkeley Law to attend a talk, because you may be in a position where you're making decisions about the future lives of Native folks. And something that's interesting about the Native community, about Indian country, is that when things are heard before judges or the Supreme Court, and actually all 570 so federal tribes get on a call to talk about the impact it will have on our communities, because something that goes to the Supreme Court and as a decision that's made will impact all of us. And so we ask that during these 3 years that you spend some time thinking about that. I'm going to move a little bit quicker through a couple other things, but one is just there's a difference between, I think, a lot of sort of Black folks' identity and Native identities. And one is that I think that, well, both of the, in the sense that I don't think we were meant to be here still. And so I think that with Native folks, there's a lot of confusion sometimes because some Native folks do not look like they're Native. And I think one of the things is exploring and getting to know other Native peoples to understand how those people will look different than maybe what you anticipated or what you've been shown. And so I think that's a really important aspect. You'll find a lot of Native folks who are very light-skinned or may not look like they're Native, and it's important to ask and understand more about who they are and their culture and where they come from. And I think that's a helpful thing for people to know about. And that can help with the activism. Lastly, and a couple other things, is the curriculum. As you all know, many of us have been through 1L or about to go through 1L, and the curriculum and getting institutional implementations of curriculum that support a vast variety of people, Native folks included, is really important. So as you all are in class, so one of the things that we try to do and hope to do is to get students, and whether through email or private chats or through one-on-one conversations, is to talk to professors about the need to bring in Native voices and into the syllabus, into the curriculum. And so those things are really important. Last, I'll just name two important real things, which is the unnaming of Kroger Hall, who was an individual who was involved in anthropology here in Berkeley. Berkeley was huge with anthropology and the collection of many Native bodies and ruins. And so they're trying to rename Kroger Hall. I think we need to sort of bring that in, but also I would like for us to have a positive naming and naming new buildings in honor of really important individuals within the community. Lastly, repatriation has been really important. But NAGPRA, which is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, is meant to return remains back to tribes. Berkeley is one of the largest holders of those remains because of the anthropology department and Hearst Museum, and has yet to return those. I'm going to add some links that talk about the need for that, but I want to make sure and end my time a little bit short and give that back to you all. Thank you so much.
Hi, everybody. I just want to thank Dallas for his insightful remarks. I also want to thank everyone who's tuning in, who's carving out time in their schedule to listen to this important conversation that needs to be had, especially during a global pandemic and as wildfires are raging all around us. It makes it hard for students and communities to engage the way they would otherwise, especially last year. So I just want to thank everyone tuning in for this presentation. Like Dean Chemerinsky said, my name is Ida Ebeid. I'm a third-year law student at Berkeley Law, and last year I was the president of the Middle Eastern and North African Law Students Association, otherwise known as NALSA. And I was also part of the curriculum committee where we made very important changes to the 1L curriculum that 1Ls currently are now seeing, including property being discharged as a required class for graduation. And that would, in effect, free up space for 1Ls to take electives that appeal to them and that would enrich their overall first-year curriculum and law school experience. But I don't have time to talk about both initiatives, so I'm going to reserve my remarks to talk about a campaign that NALSA launched last year to change the Berkeley Law application on LSAC to declassify Middle Easterners and North Africans as white or Caucasian. As many of you probably know, the US government classifies all peoples from the Middle East and North Africa as white or Caucasian. That means people from Morocco, Tunisia, Jordan, Egypt, Palestine, Iraq, etc., are all classified as white. Which the history of why this is long, anti-Black, and racist. And I could spend my remarks talking about why, but I would go over, and instead I want to focus about what NALSA did to remedy this problem, at least within the walls of the Berkeley Law Institution. So when I was a 2L and president of NALSA, I decided why not write a letter to the administration asking them to, at least on their applications for law school, declassify men of people under white. I, along with my board members, and now the current president of NALSA, Arman Sharif, and Rasha Suleiman, co-presidenting NALSA, as well as my fellow 3L, Anissa Narasa. We wrote this letter to Dean Alvarez and Dean Chemerinsky, explaining why this change needs to be had. And if anyone tuning in is of Middle Eastern and North African descent, I'm sure you know how difficult it is to identify yourself on any application, whether it's a job application, academic application, loan application, whatever it is, because you want to be truthful to your identity and maybe the intersecting identities that you may have as a mixed person, for example, but you also don't want to erroneously classify yourself as white, despite what the US government may think, because A, you are not white, and B, you're not even socialized as white in America, as the recent deportations of Persians back to Iran in January demonstrated. So we wrote this letter, and in the process of us sharing it on Facebook and soliciting signatures, something funny and interesting that arose was I got a message from a since graduated 3L. Her name is Nairi, and she reached out to me saying that she was so happy that we were pressing for this change, because when she was an undergrad at UC Berkeley, she actually led a very successful campaign to get the undergraduate institution to decouple MENA from white. And thanks to her efforts, the Berkeley undergraduate demographic application section is extremely robust and exhaustive and accurate. I think it runs around 2 to 3 pages long, trying to capture all the different races and ethnicities one might possibly identify as. I was able to touch base with her and get her insights on how she was able to lead a successful campaign there. And that just goes to show that you have no idea what really anyone in your cohort is doing and all the things that they accomplished before coming to law school, especially if they're in different class years as you. So it's worth getting to know them in more intimate settings like this. But that was a connection that I was very fortunate to make there. So she helped us write the letter, and we sent it to Dean Alvarez and Dean Chemerinsky, and they were receptive. But the only roadblock that we came across is, and I didn't know this before this campaign, is that most public institutions have 2 sections to their demographic application. There is a section that goes to the US government and aids in their reporting, and it has to comply with their reporting requirements, which means that if Middle Easterners are mentioned at all, or North Africans, either they're grouped under white or Caucasian, or they're left out completely. And there's a second part of the application that is for Berkeley's own internal records that doesn't get sent to the US government. So for the first part, which was the most difficult part, because we could not have Middle Eastern and North African be its own separate racial category, we decided that at least to avoid the injustice of MENA students erroneously misidentifying themselves as white on a formal record, remove any reference to Middle Eastern or North African as a subcategory against white, which is what we did. And as for the second part, we were given way more leeway as to what we could accomplish. So we added Middle Eastern and North African as separate discrete categories that one could identify as. And another thing that we noticed was Berkeley Law was asking students in the second part of their application what identity do you identify most strongly as? Pick only one. So for mixed individuals or biracial individuals, this is obviously very difficult. If they identify equally with both sides of their heritage, and even if they don't, it's strange to prompt a multicultural, multi-ethnic student to identify with one side of their ethnicity. So we broke that question up into 2 questions. Now we ask students to be exhaustive as to what racial or ethnic categories they identify as, to give them more freedom of identification and expression. And if they happen to identify with one side more strongly, they are able to do so in a separate optional question. And I think one thing that I'm really proud of is we were able to add language in the first part of the application, which goes to the US government, acknowledging how limiting and under exhaustive their categories are. And if Berkeley law can make a change, my hope is that other law schools can make a change. And because the ABA is not a public institution, it is not beholden to the US government's racist ethnic categories, then they could just as easily have Middle Eastern or North African be its own separate category. And probably that would usher in a change for other professional organizations. So I don't know where I'm at with regards to time. I just want to say that these changes are ready to go as to this application cycle and all subsequent application cycles. And I was very proud and honored to be a part of it. And I think despite all its successes, it was long overdue. And I'm sure in 30 years, we'll look back and be like, why were we classifying MENA students as white for so long? Why is the government getting away with that? And hopefully there'll be more conversation as to that history and that narrative, hopefully soon. But I want to hand it over to Justin now for his remarks.
Good afternoon. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that there was a police shooting of another Black person named Jacob Blake just yesterday in Wisconsin. Jacob was fighting for his life in the hospital, but is now in stable condition. To Black people and allies tuned into this call, who are continuing the fight against anti-Blackness in the carceral state, let us allow the words of Assata Shakur to guide our pursuits. She says, "It is a duty to fight for our freedom. It is our duty to win. We must love each other and protect each other. We have nothing to lose but our chains." I'd like to acknowledge the unprecedented conditions we find ourselves in today. For some, it's hard to get out of bed, and for others, it's hard to breathe. So I'd like to invite you to take a moment to just inhale and exhale deeply with me for just 10 seconds, wherever you find yourself. Thank you. I am very grateful for the opportunity to speak on this topic of student activism today. It is because of the sacrifices of ancestors like Kwame Ture, Audre Lorde, Stephen Bantu Biko, Assata Shakur, Frantz Fanon, Ida B. Wells, James Baldwin, W.B. Du Bois, Derek Bell, Zora Neale Hurston, Cedric Robinson, Thurgood Marshall, and so many more that I am here before each of you. And I'm also proud to be among this panel of awe-inspiring students. Thank you. It is very important to be talking about student activism on the heels of this summer's uprising. But it is also always important to talk about student activism. And I hope that this is an ongoing conversation at Berkeley Law and beyond. When I came to Berkeley Law, my sole focus was on the over-incarceration, over-policing of communities of color, Black people in particular. That is what prompted my journey towards law school and my desire to become a lawyer. With roots in Mississippi and St. Martin, as a Black American Afro-Caribbean man, what has held true consistently is that I have encountered many societal institutions and structures that have shaped my life. Many of them have been extensions of state-sanctioned violence against me and those who look like me. I've experienced the violence of policing and being held in a jail cell. I've experienced the violence of environmental racism and educational racism in my schools, textbooks that tended to erase the history of slavery. My arrival to Berkeley Law has been one in which I have been sort of exposed to this new body of knowledge, or truth even, that has been shielded from me for a majority of my life, even though I've experienced the extent to which the law has affected me. So I felt a responsibility to liquidate the knowledge that is often hoarded by higher ed institutions. The people we tend to talk about in the classroom, and so we're here to serve, are often not exposed to the same set of transformative knowledge about, for example, how the law restricts, constructs, decides, and determines their lived experience and existence. The law tends to shorten lives and decrease the quality of life for many. This holds true in particular for Black, Indigenous people of color. So this previous school year, I began to write. I wrote mainly because I felt as if there was so much going on back home that I felt beholden to. I felt a responsibility for, to assist in calling out and acknowledging the violence that many members of my community were experiencing. But non-academic writing is something that law school students are not encouraged to do. Maybe PhD students or the grad students are. But in law school, you're prompted to stick to your studies. And once you make it out of law school, you have the opportunity to do that if you choose to. But publishing in arenas that are accessible to the larger public is something that is not so much encouraged. But I decided to write 4 articles last year that I would discuss briefly today. The first was about my childhood friend, Joshua Norman. He was a Black man with a beautiful spirit who I used to play basketball with every single day of my childhood in my neighborhood. Then it was quite important for us to congregate and create an insular community within the larger legacies of the Jim Crow South in my hometown. Josh was stolen by the state from my community at an early age. He was incarcerated for a number of years for threatening a white man with a beer bottle, which his judge took to be a violent weapon. And afterwards, Josh went in and out of the system. And sadly, this year, Josh was found hanging in a prison cell. His death was number 11 on the long list of people who have died while incarcerated in the state of Mississippi. Josh's story spoke to me. And even though I was in the middle of a lot of things and busy with law school, I just had to write about it. It saddened me deeply because he was one of my childhood heroes who taught me a lot about basketball, but also about life. I published it in a newspaper back home and with an online publication. And it was important for me to raise his name, raise the concerns of recidivism and the conditions of our state prison system. After writing the article, I realized that the knowledge I gained in criminal law and in the law school in general can have a large impact on community dialogue. Community members were engaging with the piece, and I realized that this was the type of role of community engagement and activism that I wanted to play in society. It made me rethink the role of lawyers, law school, and law students. And it was very important to showcase for my hometown that although I have gone away for law school, I am here, always willing to serve. Following that article, I was back home when the summer uprising started, and I was sitting with my grandmother as we were watching the CNN headlines come in with different developments about the murder of George Floyd. It was taxing for everyone. And to cope, I turned to my pen and started writing. I called my mentor and we were discussing different ways to approach the topic. And somehow we arrived at divest from police departments and invest in communities. I sent it to a few publishers and they changed the title to Defund the Police, which I thought was the perfect headline. I submitted it, published it, and the next weekend the article was in conversation with articles across the world. It was quite fascinating to see, and the streets picked up on it. There were signs at the protest demonstration saying, "Defund the police." And that was part of a moment that obviously started way before me, but that galvanized the public to support a non-criminal justice reform to address policing, something that has yet to be truly embraced by the mainstream. Following that, I worked with a local investigative journalist by the name of Cole Braggs, who led this initiative to uncover evidence in a case in regards to Ricky Ball, a Black man who was killed in 2015 by a white police officer in Columbus, Mississippi. The Attorney General of Mississippi, Lynn Fitch, decided to close the investigation only days following the murder of George Floyd, which I took to be intentional and a political move, undoubtedly. And once she pulled that last lever, access to the doors of justice were closed. So Cole and I spent hours going through the case files and discovered different ways to walk through the night Ricky Ball was killed and the failures of his case. We wrote an article in regards to what the Ball family had not found out about the evidence at hand and how what Lynn Fitch did was a miscarriage of justice. And most recently, I wrote an article about a county supervisor in my neighboring city who said Black people have been dependent since slavery, which I took to not only be violent, but wicked and evil. I share all this to say that writing is my way of showcasing my activism. It is through writing and being engaged with on-the-ground abolitionists who are concerned with ways that we can achieve justice, even without law, that I remain active. To new and continuing students, if there is a type of activism that you want to do while in law school, do it. Don't adhere to any traditions around what it means to be a law student. For the most part, the traditional route is something that we feel pressured to pursue. But law school is what you make it, and you have the opportunity to create your own experience. Following 1L, you can take any class you want, which makes you a unique student who has been exposed to different bodies of law based on your own decisions, choices, and desires. Do not waste this opportunity. Trailblaze your own path and allow your heart to lead the way. I hope to join the long tradition of lawyers who are continuously engaged with community members. And today I challenge each law student who has a desire to write, to be active, to not neglect your studies, but allow the community and the world around you to complement your studies, to inform how you look at case law, to inform your comments and your questions in class. Everything happening around us is important to our legal education. Every day, justice is being restricted. Every day, justice is being expanded. And it is important for us as law students of the 21st century and lawyers of the next generation to start expanding justice today, to always be in community with those who society tells us matter the least, those in the streets, those of marginalized identities, and those who depend on us to create a safer and better tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you, Justin. I'm excited to start talking about what LSAD has been working on this summer, but first I want to be clear that Berkeley has much more work to do than simply hosting panels where students of color talk about the activism that they are engaged in, especially when that work is unfunded and not explicitly supported by the law school. So with that being said, I'll share some of what LSAD has been doing in response to our work in the current climate. As many of you know, LSAD, led by 3L's Maya Harmon and Maya Campbell, organized an open letter to Chancellor Christ demanding that UCPD be defunded and that the university sever ties with BPD. In making our case, we cited UCPD's harassment of 2 Black students in 2019, as well as UCPD's use of excessive force when interacting with 2 Black children later that same year. The death of Kayla Moore while in BPD custody was also highlighted in the letter. In response to this letter that, in just a week, garnered over 2,000 signatures from Cal students, staff, and alum, Chancellor Christ wrote LSAD an email. This response from the chancellor did not explicitly engage with the open letter that we sent her. Instead of engaging with our demands, the chancellor sent a sort of formal response that, among other things, voiced support for a more diverse police force. Not only was his email inadequate, but it was dismissive. To bring attention to the chancellor's email and LSAD's initial letter, I started an op-ed campaign. My goal was to increase the visibility of our demands outlined in the letter and show that the chancellor would have to engage with students who would continue to make the time to push for these reforms. Hopefully this would lead to collaboration and then concessions. In order to do this, I reached out to other affinity group leaders at Berkeley Law and interested Black grads across campus. About 20 students responded and signed up to either author an op-ed or edit the work of their peers. So for those 20 students that joined the coalition this summer, I'm especially grateful for their help, especially when so many other activist works were looking for their engagement. So for the op-ed campaign, the topics that we wrote about included the inadequacy of Chancellor Christ's response, the militarization of BPD, and community-oriented alternatives to public safety. Thus far, we've gotten 3 placements, with the rest of the pieces currently being shopped to different outlets or in the editing stage. My piece in particular, which was published in the Daily Cal a few weeks ago, appears to have gotten the attention of the Chancellor. This week, myself and my co-president, Ebeid, will be meeting with the co-chair of the Chancellor's Independent Advisory Board on Police Accountability and the Associate Chancellor to discuss my op-ed and LSAD's vision for community safety. While I welcome this conversation, I do want to emphasize that the open letter and the op-ed were both addressed to Chancellor Christ, who has not meaningfully engaged with either yet. Still, I do not see this week's conversation as the end of our work. Rather, LSAD plans to continue communicating our vision of a police-free UC and hosting our own panels where we discuss alternatives to policing that prioritize community safety of marginalized groups. So what I'll say to students interested in activism and community advocacy work is remember that all this might not necessarily go on your resume or get you pro bono hours or be popular in interviews with future employers, but it is critical for the Black community and for all disadvantaged communities. And we have a particular responsibility as future legal professionals to look out for the least empowered. To professors and staff, I'd ask that you keep in mind the onus of community advocacy and activism that students have taken on, whether you see the import of their work or not. While we are here to learn the law from you, there's much you can learn from us, particularly from our lived experiences as students of color and our own institutional knowledge from our pre-law school careers. There's a space for academia and armchair theorizing, but there's no substitute for allyship that is loud, present, and might make the ally uncomfortable, but will make a substantial difference to the community impacted. I say all of this with the lack of the support that LSAD received from law school faculty and administration in mind when we sent our open letter around. While the cold response from the university for community-oriented alternatives to public safety was not surprising, I expected something different from Berkeley Law. You can look at the dozens of pages of signatures and find more biology professors had signed on than law school professors. Of the law school professors and staff we reached out to solicit support, only 2 responded to our email, and only the dean engaged in an albeit fruitless discussion. As an institution lauded as a public interest powerhouse and progressive space, this was really concerning. So in closing, if the university staff and faculty do take anything away from this panel, I hope that it's that working at a public university is not the end of your public service. There is activism for you to engage in too, and lives depend on it. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you. I feel really grateful and honored to be on this panel with the rest of you. Again, my name is Maya Campbell, and I'm a 3L. Knychelle has already gone into the specific mechanics of her work, and Maya Harmon is going to follow up in a minute with a little bit more on this in a second. So I'm going to use my time to highlight the importance of our asks. Again, we're asking the Chancellor to divest from the Berkeley Police Department and to fund UCPD. To those unfamiliar with police abolition or the movement for Black lives, this ask may seem impossible, unrealistic, or maybe even terrifying. That's fair. But the core of our demands is the fight for Black lives and the daily fear that Black people are experiencing. We see this work as a continuation of the efforts that LSAD and other Black campus organizations have done to increase the numbers and elevate the voices of Black students on the UC Berkeley campus. Our numbers in the law building have increased, and every class, starting with the class of 2018, has been the largest number of Black students in the law school's history. Just this past spring, the undergrad campus touted a record number of Black admits. But the work cannot stop there. Black students are disproportionately at risk for police harassment, violent or otherwise. What good is it to bring us on campus and celebrate our presence if we're not safe? What good is it to invest in our educations if the administration is not going to take the steps to actively protect our lives? The clear, simple fact is that police do not make us more safe. The police have been touted as a safety solution, as a way to protect bodies, lives, and property. But there are underlying questions here, like whose body, whose life, whose property? And why does protecting property take precedence over Black life? The police respond to crimes, they do not prevent them. Many of the police prevention tactics employed by the police rely on racist and cis and heteronormative standards, which place Black and brown people and queer and trans people, and of course, those who sit at the intersections of these identities, directly under the police's microscope. And for so many Black and Indigenous people of color, any resulting encounter with the police often ends in death. We've all seen the terms driving while Black, walking while Black, jogging while Black, sleeping while Black, standing while Black. And we've all heard the names: Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Trayvon Martin, Atatiana Jefferson, Elijah McClain, the list goes on. As Justin mentioned, just last night, police in Kenosha, Wisconsin shot Jacob Blake in front of his children as he was attempting to break up a domestic dispute. This violence is daily. And each instance reaffirms the fact the basic act of existence puts our lives in danger. And this is no different on this campus and throughout the Berkeley community. UCPD and Berkeley PD have brutalized and harassed Black and Indigenous people of color. We deserve to feel safe here. We have been offered spots at this institution. But I reiterate, the work to make sure that we are safe when we physically take up space on this campus has yet to be done. We're asking for a leap of imagination and an act of faith. Imagine for a second what a world without police would look like. Imagine what safety would look like without the looming presence of a racist institution. Imagine what safety would look like if, instead of force, we prioritize forms of protection that placed empathy and compassion at their cores. And what if we placed faith in Black and brown organizers and thinkers who have made it their life work to advocate for and formulate these very solutions? I and the other LSAD members see our work as a logical extension of our legal education. We came to Berkeley Law to learn how to be advocates, and we're leveraging our education and our platforms as law students to advocate for change here on this campus and beyond. So again, to some of you, this work may seem new, but I would like to highlight the fact that this is generations old advocacy. The fight goes all the way back to the abolition of slavery, to the Tulsa Massacre, to Rodney King, scholars and activists such as Angela Davis, Alex Vitale, Alicia Garza, Derica Purnell, And campus organizations such as Disarm UCPD have been doing this work for a very long time. So I'm going to end with one additional ask. I'm asking that the administration listen to us. We've written our letters, we're appearing on this panel, we're taking the time to rally our fellow students. But all of this means nothing if the administration only treats our efforts as a novelty or dismisses our concerns. I appreciate being asked to join this panel, but the time that I've taken to put together these remarks and deliver them all to you means very little if we do not garner administrative and faculty support. I urge you all to take that leap of imagination and to act on faith. Cede your power and your comfort. Please join us. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Maya Harmon, and I'm a 3L. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm honored to be here among these amazing student activists that I'm lucky enough to call my classmates and my friends. And I'd also like to thank Dean Chemerinsky for inviting me to be on this panel. So I never set out to be an activist. I came to law school with the same plans as many of my fellow students. I planned to study hard, participate in a few extracurricular activities, and get a job doing something that can make a positive difference in people's lives. But all over the country, including on our own campus, police are brutalizing and murdering Black people. And I couldn't stay silent. After the police murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, and so many others, I started to think about what I could do to hopefully make a difference. I concluded that a great place to start was on my own campus. The University of Minnesota had just severed most of its ties with the Minneapolis Police Department, and calls to defund and abolish the police were mounting across the country. So I spearheaded the demand letter that you've heard Maya and Knychelle talk about in their remarks. Our letter demanded that UC Berkeley cut ties with Berkeley Police Department, defund and disarm UCPD, and review UCPD's use of force policies. We called for UC Berkeley to redirect funds that would otherwise be used on policing to the development of alternatives to policing and to campus and community organizations that focus on public health and safety. These include the Basic Needs Fund, the Anti-Police Terror Project, and the East Bay Community Law Center. In the span of only about a week, our letter got 179 organizational signatures and 2,468 individual signatures. Yet, as others on this panel have explained, Chancellor Christ's response was inadequate. She barely even acknowledged our demands. One thing she did propose was to, quote, build stronger connections with campus constituents through meetings and listening sessions, end quote. We never asked for anything like that. Let me be clear. Campuses like UC Berkeley already have all the information they need to make a change. Black students have been telling campus leadership for years that we face discrimination, an increased likelihood of becoming a victim of police violence, a lack of resources, and more. These types of information gathering campaigns, as I call them, are an attempt to placate student activists and buy the administration time until the current group of student activists graduates. The problems are right in front of them if they only choose to look. Some have pushed for reform instead of abolition, or want to know why reform isn't enough. Well, the truth of the matter is, we've tried reform. It doesn't work. Minneapolis PD is one of the most reformed, progressive police departments in the country, but that didn't stop them from murdering George Floyd. Police have already killed 731 people in 2020. In 2019, they killed 1,098. Modern police departments originated as slave patrols. Their entire purpose was to ensure the subjugation of Black people by catching and punishing runaway slaves. A system like that cannot be reformed. Another danger of reforms is that they can actually end up further entrenching police within our institutions and communities. Reforms such as more training and better technology can result in police departments receiving more funding when we want them to receive less. Community policing can make it more difficult to get rid of police departments because it gives them leverage to argue that they are integral parts of our communities. At the very least, any reforms adopted by campus must be abolitionist in nature, which means that they should bring us closer to the goal of abolishing UCPD. Furthermore, we've all seen the way that police have been behaving at protests across the country. When police show up to a protest against police brutality, the officers can be best conceptualized as counter-protesters. They aren't there to protect our First Amendment right to protest or to ensure that people are safe. They're there to terrorize the people that they view as a threat to their profession. Cops at protests have grabbed people off the street in unmarked vans, pushed down a 70-year-old man, causing him to sustain a skull injury, shot protesters with rubber bullets, blinding some of them, tased 2 college students and yanked them out of their car when they were just trying to get home, destroyed medical and water supplies, beaten people with batons, tear-gassed protesters, and more. We've seen the video evidence. Police are a threat to our lives and a threat to our First Amendment rights. It's time for radical change, not incremental steps. It's time to stop prioritizing the imagined comfort of white students, parents, faculty, and staff, and to start listening to Black, Brown, and Indigenous students, parents, faculty, and staff who are telling you that having police on campus makes us less safe. How many Black people have to be brutalized on and near this campus and across the country for you to listen? Just last night, police officers in Kenosha, Wisconsin shot Jacob Blake, a Black man, 7 times in the back as he tried to get into his car. His children were in the car and witnessed their father get shot. They'll be traumatized for the rest of their lives. He's now in serious condition, and it's unclear whether or not he'll recover. And he is one of many who have been shot at the hands of the deeply racist, corrupt institution of police. We are tired. We're fed up. We're demanding change, and we're not going to stop until we get it. So if you're thinking about getting involved in activism, where do you start? As you've seen from my fellow panelists, activism can take many forms. It can look like writing op-eds, calling your representatives, speaking with campus administration, sharing information on social media, or going to protests. Start by identifying the problem that you would like to address. Then decide what community you're going to focus on. That could be your school, your city, your state, your country. Think about the skills that you bring to the table and where your efforts would be most useful. Get plugged in with organizations and individuals who have already been doing the work and find out how you can help. Or start your own initiative. Activism is one of many ways to push for societal change. We must all do our part to shape the world that we want to live in. We must demand an end to racism and the structures that are committed to upholding it, including the police. We can and we will make a change. Thank you.
My thanks to each of you for those terrific presentations. There are just a couple of questions to this point. Obviously, send them in and I'll relay them. The first, which may very well be from a 1L, how do you each balance your student activism with your schoolwork, your pro bono work, your other commitments, and the rest of your lives? Each of you or any of you, thoughts to give to the students, and I guess especially to 1Ls, about how you do this? Dallas, since you went first.
I can go ahead.
I never cold call on anyone, so I feel uncomfortable doing that. But I do think it's a question that'll be of great interest.
You know, I was a teacher beforehand and thought that I could really juggle a lot. And law school taught me that's not true. And so I think, as you know, Maya and others have said, is really sort of thinking about what really matters to you. For me, lots of things matter. I would say my first year was hard to balance. I spent a lot of time working towards a lot of these initiatives and not always getting to spend all my time on schooling. So I think being aware of what it is that you're here for, I know Maya, who just spoke, said that, you know, she came here to just focus on schooling and then is really involved in a lot of initiatives. And so I think doing your best to care about things you care about will keep you in the right place.
Do others want to speak to that question of how you balance your various commitments?
I can speak to this a little bit.
Thank you.
The truth of the truth of the matter is that it can be really difficult to balance. And like, I know this summer when I was working on the demand letter, I was also balancing law review responsibilities. I was also trying to get ready for my summer job and apply to clerkships. And you spend all this time on this activism that, you know, there's a certain injustice about the fact that students of color have to spend all this extra time on these activism efforts when white students have the privilege of focusing on school and only school, and not necessarily feeling the pressure of having to show up for their communities based on the fear that if we don't show up for our communities, we might not be here the following year. We might see a drop in Black enrollment or in Native enrollment once again if we don't participate in all of these extracurricular activities and efforts. So, I mean, I don't really have good advice on how to balance it other than to just figure out what is important to you. And if activism is what you want to focus on, then focus on that. Like, don't feel pressured to only study all the time if there are things that you want to get involved in. And also try to look out for your mental health and your well-being, because it can be taxing to work on these initiatives. Make sure you're taking time for self-care and doing things that you enjoy as well.
One other thing that I'd add to that is the fact that often we're not doing it alone. We do these things in community with other students and with our peers. And it's good to have other people that you can lean on when you feel like you're exhausted, or if you feel like you just can't take on any more that week. You know, the world has really gotten to you, or you're just, you know, tired, and school is saying you have to do some reading. You can lean on everybody else and say, like, I need a moment. And often, because we're all in this together, we're receptive and we're like, I'll cover it for you. So remember, you're never alone in it. It might feel like it sometimes, but you never really are.
Does anyone else want to speak to that before the next question? Okay. The next question that I got was, much of what discussed concerned activism within the law school and especially on our campus. How do you decide whether it's more important to fight at that level as opposed to more national issues?
I can speak on this. It reminds me of a conversation I had with friends just a couple of days ago. Because to me, I didn't see my work as activism necessarily, because I would much prefer to tackle issues that are affecting people who exist outside the law school, recognizing that we are incredibly privileged to be here, and already, no matter what our identities are, we occupy a very special place that most people could never hope to reach. But the problem is, when there are glaring issues within your law school and your institution, sometimes, and it's a totally understandable impulse to want to fix those issues first, and remedy problems that the administration or the institution should have remedied for you, to make it a more hospitable place for you to learn before you can even think about tackling the issues that are brutalizing your communities. You could choose either or. For me, it was easier to focus on the law school, because if you don't do it, it'll never get done. Or it will get done and you'll never hear about it. But there are people, and many people on this panel, who've chosen to focus on more national issues, and that is completely valid and warranted and needed. So it's just a decision you have to come for yourself. And sometimes you just want to fix something that really needs to be fixed at your law school, within the community, before you can focus on what's happening outside, with the fear that if it never gets fixed, you'll never know if it ever did. And by then you'll be a practicing attorney, and you're leaving that choice up to the next generation of law students. And for me, that was like, well, if it can be fixed now, I might as well fix it now. So So those are just my initial thoughts, and it's a challenging decision that plagues me a lot, but I'd be interested in hearing what everyone else has to say too.
I think that's an amazing question. And I think Ida's points are really well. I also think that it doesn't have to be a binary decision or choice. I think that your experience in law school informs the national conversation and dialogue, and the national conversation and dialogue informs your experiences in law school. Because the activism that you do on campus tends to impact law students and professors, law students who will go on to become VAs, attorneys, and judges, and different officials who will have a lot of power one day and influence a lot of people's lives. And so I feel like you don't have to make an ultimate decision or choice. Whatever pulls you and tugs at you, follow it, do it. First year I launched a podcast with one of my classmates named Serena, and that's what I wanted to focus on at that time. And then after that, focusing on that issue on campus, I then wanted to kind of jump into the national dialogue around defunding police. And defunding the police now informed the UCPD conversation around defunding the UCPD police. And so it's always intersecting and in conversation with each other. And so don't feel like you have to make an ultimate decision, but allow the kind of path to kind of naturally make its way.
Do others of you want to speak to this question?
One, it probably piggybacks up of what Justin just said, but law school is connected to the rest of the world. The work that you do here does have links to greater society. So really, I don't really think that there is anything that only exists on campus. It's always going to have connections to the outside world. There are some efforts that might be a little bit more broad. Police brutality on campus also. If we're talking about UCPD and BPD, we're also talking about the police department in Berkeley writ large, but nothing really just exists in one spot. Everything has ripples.
I think we have time for one more question. This came as especially for the 3Ls, but I would ask all of you, I know most of you are 3Ls, how do you see continuing activism on these issues after graduating from law school? Any of you want to speak to that?
I can start.
Thank you.
So I definitely plan to remain involved in these and other issues. There's obviously so much going on in our nation and our world that needs to be fixed. And I don't plan on ever tuning out of that conversation, on ever distancing myself from those efforts. And whether it's a totally new initiative that I decide to get involved in, or whether it's something that kind of piggybacks off of the efforts that I'm making now, I think they're both just as valuable, and I have just as much interest in pursuing both. To speak specifically to the efforts towards defunding UCPD and eventually abolishing them, I hope that in cities across the country, we can start defunding and abolishing city police departments. I plan to live and work in LA when I graduate, and LAPD is a huge target for me. I plan to get involved in those efforts, and I know Black Lives Matter Los Angeles has been very involved in those efforts. They're pushing for like a people's budget, which directs a substantial amount of money from LAPD to communities of color and to other programs that are being ignored right now, like education and resources for unhoused people. And so kind of like what Maya was saying, like these issues do not stand in isolation, and an issue that you see on campus is very likely an issue that also exists in other places, whether that is a lack of diversity at the school and a lack of diversity in your workplace, or that's campus policing and city policing and state policing and federal policing. These issues have to be tackled in all these different arenas. So I think law school can be a great place to start. And I know it won't be the end of my efforts. It's only the beginning. And I'm sure that many others that are engaged in these initiatives can relate as well.
Do others of you want to speak to that question?
I hope to continue this role of activism or activist efforts. After law school, I'm interested in pursuing more degrees. I think a legal education is very important, but is also limiting in some ways. And I think that some of the issues facing society can be answered by broader questions around social movements, politics, not the law necessarily. I'm interested in conversations or dialogues about what justice looks like without the law. And so I'm interested in pursuing more degrees. And if any students find themselves 3Ls, 2Ls, or 1Ls, find themselves kind of like, law school has been very beneficial for me, but I also think that I'm interested in other questions. It's okay to pursue those things following law school. If you have a lot of debt, that is something that's kind of intimidating to do. But I think you should, once again, like I said earlier, just allow your heart to lead you. And if there are questions that you seek to answer in your life's journey, do it regardless of what the limitations you feel like you have placed upon yourself. Pursue those degrees, pursue those questions, and commit yourself to a life full of activism, regardless of whatever avenues you want to take it.
Thank you. Any other comments to that, or any other final words? Anything that anybody on the panel wanted to say that they didn't get the chance to say? We have a couple of minutes left.
I'll just speak really quickly to just what I'm doing after. I think, I've tried to actually get away from activism or being involved. I think as a teacher, I did a lot of that, got really exhausted, and somehow Berkeley recharged me, and I'm doing it again. I think that my hope is to still be in strong connection with the student orgs that I've been a part of. I see us sort of like graduate on, and then we sort of take on our jobs. So my hope is to still be a huge resource for them financially, but also just with knowledge. And then with my firm, I'll be at a firm in DC that represents and works on behalf of tribes. So I hope to continue to be doing that work on a policy level and growing more too.
And I certainly hope that all of you will continue to be involved with the law school and student organizations within the law school and with the campus even after you graduate. I want to thank each of you for those wonderful, insightful, powerful comments. Our community is so much better off from having heard from you. The next program with regard to the series on race and the law is tentatively scheduled for September 14th, so we'll be taking next week off. And it's on race and education, focusing on K through 12 education in the United States and race and the law. Please join us for that. And again, my thanks to the speakers today, and thanks to all of you for listening in. Please be safe at this very difficult time.